All righty. You heard the robotic lady. We are recording now. Thank you, everybody, for joining here. Oh, I see one familiar name already. I see two familiar names already. This is awesome. Going to do a little reunion. Before I start saying hi to everybody, we want to make sure that there are a couple of ground rules established for today's webinar. We have the chat function open, and you can type in some messages in the chat as soon as you have a question. If you do have a question, or if you want to comment and say hi to somebody or make a comment about something, that's totally fine. We'll probably wait to answer all the questions at the end of the webinar. We're going to leave probably 5 or 10 minutes for everybody to their questions in if you do have questions. So if you want to just have a little dialogue in the chat as we're talking, that's great. Otherwise, if you have any questions, hold those till the end, because odds are a lot of folks tend to have the same kind of questions, and maybe we can actually be really efficient with the questions at the very end. So we are planning on going for about the full 50 minutes and then leaving some time for Q&A at the very end, so don't you worry about that. And today, we are going to be talking about satisfactory academic progress, which, if you are a Title IV participating school, you got to deal with SAP, and so do students. And what is very surprising is that a lot of students who attend your schools may have no idea what that is, even though they probably encountered some documentation and agreed to some sort of agreement with your institution that they would maintain certain GPAs and certain course completion rates, and they would graduate within a certain maximum time frame. But when it comes time to remaining eligible, all of a sudden there are questions galore, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Teresa, do you want to say any hellos or any introductions before we start to kind of get this thing kicked off?
I do. Good morning and good afternoon. If you're joining us from the East Coast, I always like to say that. And my most favorite thing I like to ask is that you will let us know who you are in the chat. Tell us, what school you're representing. I always like to know who all is joining us today. We will love that. And you are in, as I say, for a treat. This is some information I think that all institutions need to hear. Just definitely trying to make sure that our students are successful when they do go on SAP, and that they can, be retained and graduate. So thank you, Zach.
Awesome. Great. So we will wait just another few minutes. We knew about some of the registration numbers, and we're batting about 50% so far. So we're going to wait just another minute or so. But while we're doing that, let's just go ahead and do introductions. So my name is Zach Taylor. I'm right now at the University of Southern Mississippi. As a faculty member there, I kind of research broadly communications and student success related stuff, broad umbrella there. But mainly a lot of financial aid communication type stuff. So understanding how students can be supported through that process, because we know decades and decades and decades, thousands of studies showing that if a student can get timely aid and they can understand how to reapply and renew their aid year to year, they are much more likely to be retained and graduate, right? Financial aid, if you don't have the money, you can't go to school, right? It's kind of a basic premise of higher education. So that's the kind of stuff that I take a look at. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Sarah Potter. I am with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and we are a nonprofit advocacy organization in California that has historically worked on issues impacting foster youth students and students experiencing homelessness, which is how we came to learn about the issue of SAP. And we are now leading SAP reform efforts across our state, which I'm really excited to share today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And a lot of the work that Sarah does too is trying to push at a state level and hopefully at a national level, because we all know that, the Office of Federal Student Aid and the Department of Education sets these guidelines. However, it is curious about how those guidelines are written and how institutions have a little bit of wiggle room within those regulations. That is really key. And Sarah has done an incredible amount of work to kind of read between the lines a little bit and see how can institutions be nimble and be creative, adhering to the federal policy as it is right now and being more supportive of students, but also just advocating for the policy to change a bit, because we know certain students struggle with certain things. And then last but not least, Anita, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, good morning and good afternoon. My name is Anita Rehom, and I am located in San Antonio, Texas. I work at St. Philip's College, and I am responsible for educating our students on the importance of finances. And so we want to make sure that we are teaching our students the skill set to make sound financial decisions moving forward.
Thank you, Anita. And Anita, too, is on the interesting intersection of talking about students with their finances, which a lot of times students don't understand are connected to academics and are connected to other policies. And it's also interesting when you ask students how they might remain eligible for financial aid, or asking them where their money is coming from, because where the money comes from dictates what a student needs to do to remain eligible, right? Different grants, different scholarships, funding sources have different requirements. And if students don't know those things, it's kind of part of financial wellness, is knowing where is your college money coming from. It's a huge issue. And, in 2020 and into 2021, institutions across the country got massive amounts in certain places of HERF funds. And we know a lot of institutions didn't really know where that money was going to come from or how it was going to be distributed, right? Imagine what it was like for students, being encouraged to apply for this money. And what do you mean there are very few strings attached? And what do you mean the application is only going to take me 2 minutes? And what do you mean it can cover a car repair or a little bit of rent or tuition? It was such a really sweeping legislation. And it was also a very vague legislation, as we are kind of learning it to be, a couple years down the road. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, how that confusion might have seeped in a little bit. Good to see everybody in the chat too. And those of you who knew I was a former Trellis employee, it is very near and dear to my heart. I love Trellis people. I love all the Project Success folks that I worked with. I see Steve from West Alabama. It's good to see your name again, as well as a few other folks who I used to work with. So I'm so glad that we can kind of reunite in this way. It's going to be pretty cool today. Anyway, so we're talking about making progress, how institutions can improve SAP policy. These are all going to be recommendations that largely adhere to federal policy, right? So you're not going to be not in compliance. However, you are going to be able to communicate a little better and maybe anticipate student needs a little bit better, and allow students a little bit more of an opportunity to establish their sense of belonging. So we also know a really important kind of best practice for retaining students is having them facilitate a sense of belonging. Do students feel like they belong there? And some of the recommendations that we're going to have for you today allow students to maybe get over some of those rocky first couple semesters grade-wise and remain eligible so they can develop a sense of belonging and stay enrolled. It's going to be very, very important in the future. So we're going to quickly frame the issue. Who are college students? Where do they come from? We know that only about 40% of traditionally aged college students, so 18 to 24-year-olds, enroll in post-secondary education, and that there is overrepresentation in a couple of racial groups. That has been a persistent issue for U.S. higher education for decades, right? Now, since 2020, since the pandemic, and actually, when I was working with a few of y'all in 2020 into 2021, we know that the most minoritized groups in higher ed, we're talking our low-income students, rural students, students of color, they left higher education at much greater rates than their wealthier, largely white and Asian peers. And so the gaps that the prior decades were working to close kind of just got blown open again in some ways during the pandemic, and that was a huge problem. We also know that birth rates dropped precipitously, right? Very fancy word to say that it's a very, very huge issue in higher ed coming up in the next couple of years, as the Great Recession really did impact who is going to be a college student in just a few years. So we also know that there is a really interesting enrollment trend, and that this has been a trend largely since the 1950s of the disproportionate enrollment between men and women. When I was working in college admissions, at the forefront of everyone's mind were two populations. How do we recruit adult non-traditional learners? So we're knowing that we're going to come up in an enrollment cliff soon. How do we get the adult learners? And the other question was, how do we get more men? Because so many four-year institutions are teetering on that 60-40% split. And there are many comprehensive four-year institutions and community colleges that are almost 70% women, 30% men. And men still represent half the population in this country and largely around the world. So that is another interesting enrollment trend that we're going to get a little bit of an enrollment cliff in terms of overall age of students. And there are certain demographics that aren't quite equally represented. Those of you who work in the enrollment management space, you may have seen this terrifying map, right? So lots of red on the map, right? It's not the friendliest visual. However, it does really illustrate the changing college-going population. This is just the 18 to 24-year-old demographic, right? Where are college students going to be coming from? And largely across the country, there's going to be some huge dips in that bread and butter 18 to 24-year-old residential college student population. There's also going to be a shift into talking about more so how do we recruit adult learners, maybe more online students, maybe more international students. The demographics are going to change quite a bit going on into the future. All of this is to say, very much like the business world, right? We hear all the time, it's easier to retain a customer than go out and recruit new customers. So in the business world, it's very, very common, right? People want to maintain their brand awareness and their brand imaging, right? Their customer satisfaction. They want to keep who they already have as customers. Same kind of thing in higher education, that in the future can be much more important to retain the folks you have than spend even more money trying to recruit a student you might not even get. And I think that is going to be a huge discussion change in the next couple of years. A lot of universities love to publicize record-breaking freshman enrollments, right? We had a record-breaking number of applications. But go down the road a couple of years, how many kids are actually graduating, right? Persisting through the degree. And if those traditional college-age students are going to be fewer and fewer in number, the ones you have are going to be really, really important. There needs to be much more emphasis on retention, which is why we're talking about SAP. So I am feeling a little bit of a pivot right now, and we have our other panelists today, Carla from UW-Madison. So Carla, thank you for joining here. We're not very far into it, as you can tell, and you know what we're doing. So do you want to introduce yourself quickly and talk about what you do at your school?
Yeah, definitely. And Zach, I've been here from the beginning. I just don't think you noticed me. That's fine.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
I've been sitting here quietly. It's fine. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what side of the country you're on. I'm Carla Weber-Wandell, the communications manager at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Student Financial Aid Office here, and work very closely, obviously, with our SAP communications and improving that experience for our students that have to go through that process.
Yeah. So again, kind of to zoom on who our panelists are, Sarah doing a lot of the advocacy work policy-wise, and Nita is kind of boots in the ground, listening from students about what they're actually struggling with. And Carla has a very unique job in financial aid communications, communicating many of these policies, right? And how students can advocate for themselves, how they can appeal, all those sorts of things. So my question is then, if we know that demographics will change, where are students learning about college compared to where they're learning about SAP? And if you can see in the upper or the lower right-hand corner, Steve Harvey is just bewildered because I don't know where students learn about SAP, right? We know that students learn about college through social networks, through family, through friends. We also know that college knowledge really does help explain the struggle that first-gen students have when they enter college because they don't have that support network to teach them all the things about what matriculation means and what verification might be and what time to degree might be, even what a major is, right? Basic kind of college knowledge. We know that there are some gaps there because those students may not have a college educated or a college knowledge person at home. But you go a little farther into policies that really deter enrollment and really kind of help push kids out the door, unfortunately, like SAP does. I don't know where students learn about SAP, how they learn how to appeal, how they learn how to stay eligible, how their grades are connected to their aid, right? There's kind of a gap in knowledge that we're not really facilitating at the institutional level. I know, having worked at 4 different institutions of higher ed, all of them four-year schools, not a lot of great SAP resources. Some schools are trending in the right direction, creating more materials, but it's also just a really complicated policy to explain to students, especially given now that semesters are sometimes broken into quarters or trimesters. There are winter semesters, summer semesters, right? So what does a term look like? How is GPA calculated? How many courses does a student actually need to pass or have a certain GPA with to be able to maintain eligibility for aid? So it can get really, really complicated on the student side. So Carla, do you want to talk then a little bit about the kind of SAP life cycle? I mean, where did this kind of language start? And then what does it mean for institutions like yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So SAP first came around in mid to late 70s as an amendment to the Higher Education Act, which of course should be amended every few years, but as you know, or maybe don't know, it hasn't been in quite a while at this point. So it is part of the actual regulations that we have to abide by if you are a Title IV receiving institution. And it requires those schools to follow a policy of academic progress for students to make sure that they are progressing to the point of actually earning that degree. Within that policy, we are given a little bit of flexibility to kind of establish our rules, but not many in this case. This one's pretty standardized in terms of what we have to follow. This is different than academic probation, which is typically more geared just towards the numerical side of GPA and using a GPA standard to keep progress with students. But what institutions do for academic probation is separate from the SAP policy, although there can be things that cross over. They are technically separate. But what the SAP policy does say is that whatever we do at our institution has to be at least as strict, if not stricter, than what the rules for the federal student aid regulations state.
Absolutely. And even listening to Carla speak about that, students may have encountered the idea of academic probation in high school. They may have been placed on some sort of academic status in high school. So they may have some proxy or understanding of that. But saying that it's completely different or not entirely related to a SAP policy, that in itself can be confusing, right? We're already kind of implementing multiple policies, and where are students going for accurate information? So here
and
is—
I would even, Zach, I would even take that outside of even high school and even just some pop culture references like movies and books that students might be reading that reference things. It's much more common that you hear something more general about being on academic probation or having issues with grades than you would ever have that kind of reference to financial aid in the same way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so one piece of communication that, and you're going to have access to this PowerPoint slide deck. So one thing that we would suggest maybe sharing with your students is this graphic right here. If the policy really can be distilled down to its most simple elements, it is GPA, completion rate, and maximum time frame. So if you do want to use a graphic with your students to help them visualize what SAP actually is, this would be a fantastic example because we're trying to make this stuff as simple as possible if we can. So Carla, continue on for us a little bit. What does it mean then if students don't make SAP, and what can they do from there?
Yeah, definitely. So there are really two different directions an institution might go with their SAP policy. The first is where when a student doesn't meet SAP, they would first receive a financial aid warning for one term, where they would get a term to be able to make that up before they would lose their eligibility for financial aid in a future semester. Other schools, however, including my institution, UW-Madison, we actually fail our students right away. So instead of checking every payment period that they're receiving financial aid, we just check once a year. And as we're making that check once a year, we're notifying students that they've lost their eligibility for financial aid and giving them the options of what they can do to reestablish that eligibility. The eligibility, like we were talking about there, is the GPA, so 2.0 minimum or C average at most institutions. There's also completion rate, so students need to be completing at least 2/3 of the courses that they're enrolling in each semester or each year. And then there's also the 150% rule, which tracks to make sure that students are graduating within 150% of the credits required for their degree. So more a little bit on the warning here. It's hard for me to talk about because my school, like I said, we don't do the financial aid warning. So Zach, maybe if you want to comment more here, but it really just gives students a little bit more of a heads up that they might be in some trouble coming up before they have to go into that appeal process. Though I would say even as an institution that doesn't do formal warnings. We do have a process where, especially with our students in our high financial need programs, we do communicate with them at the semester point in the academic year if we are noticing that their grades might cause them to fail SAP later in the year. But Zach, do you want to say anything about what you know about that warning period?
I would love to, because that is actually some of the wiggle room we're going to talk about in a bit, right? Is that, and no shade to UW-Madison, right? I mean, they have their process and it's a very large institution and they're going to check once a year. However, there are lots of institutions that either check with every payment period or every academic term, whatever that looks like at your school, right? Because we know too that some schools are implementing things like 6-week semesters, little micro terms, right? You can actually check SAP status and GPA and, time to degree, all those kind of things much more frequently, and then give students an opportunity to get a little bit of a warning, right? A little bit of pre-warning to say, hey, one more semester like this, and you may really be in trouble. And you can be a little more proactive in that way. So there are some schools that just outright, check once a year and put you on a status of ineligibility. There are other schools who check it a little more frequently and give students a little bit more of a warning so they can remedy their status a little bit more. I can talk a little bit more about this here. So basically, if a student then who is at a school that allows for a financial aid warning or something like that, and the schools identified them as either not maintaining the GPA threshold or the course completion threshold, students can make a financial aid appeal. And those of you who are at schools, and if you are in a financial aid or financial wellness office, one exercise you can do right now is your appeal made very, very clear on the website? Have you even communicated appeals to students, right? If you do place them on financial aid warning status, or if when you check for SAP status and you do those audits every semester or every year, is that appeal information very, very clear? Because the federal policy also allows for institutions to accept appeals on behalf of students so they can maintain eligibility, right? A little bit of flexibility there. So if a student successfully appeals, they can be put on financial aid probation status. However, if they do not end up meeting those qualitative and quantitative standards, right, the GPA thresholds, the max timeframes, then they can reach financial aid ineligible status. And essentially, what the research says is that once a student is ineligible for federal financial aid, they basically are not going to graduate, right? That is a little bit of a death sentence for a lot of college students, that if they cannot get federal student aid, it is a really long road back of remediation. It also makes it really difficult for a student to actually stay at their institution, right? Because they may have to take, extra coursework, or they may have to, go through some other kind of appeal process. It gets very, very difficult and complicated, exploring different aid types and making sure that they can come back and remedy their status. So it gets really, really difficult from there. We also know that, this is a really, really helpful graphic for institutions, talking about kind of how institutions can evaluate SAP, either every pay period, or it could be after every single academic term if you have micro terms, but you only have one payment period per semester. So Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about this, about kind of what you've learned about how institutions actually do this auditing and how frequently it is, and then how are students allowed to appeal through some of these processes?
Sure. So I think there's sort of an important distinction here depending on the academic calendar in any given institution. So if an institution uses the semester system, it makes a lot more sense for them to evaluate SAP every semester at the end of every semester, so they can afford students the opportunity to file or to get a warning status and kind of know what they need to do to get back into good standing, just like Zach mentioned. Using the semester system as an example here again, if that student does not meet SAP for the next consecutive term, so 2 consecutive terms in total, they are disqualified from receiving financial aid unless they are able to either come back into good SAP standing, go to school without receiving financial aid, which we know is not necessarily the best scenario, or if they're able to successfully file an appeal with their financial aid department. Something really important to note about the flexibilities that campuses have in federal regulation is that if they offer an appeals process, they must include death of a relative or injury or illness of the student as the basis for an appeal. However, they're also given the ability to define other special circumstances that will form the basis of an appeal. And this is where we have seen in our scan of every public post-secondary institution in California, just huge variances. So some campuses will explicitly exclude certain types of special circumstances. In fact, they'll state if there's anything that's foreseeable, then you cannot file an appeal. Some of them will have very strict policies that will only accept appeals on the basis of death of a relative or injury or illness of the student, and they won't define special circumstances. Whereas others, especially those that have been a bit more equity focused, they will include a very broad range of special circumstances, including things like transportation issues, change or loss of income, childcare issues, pregnancy and birth, mental behavioral health conditions. So this is a really important lever that campuses have to make sure that students are able to maintain their financial aid. I will say specifically on the issue of campuses that are on a quarter system, the FSA regulations and FSA handbook actually only require that SAP be evaluated annually. That's the federal requirement. So in the case of a quarter system, it makes a lot more sense for campuses to evaluate only annually, so students are able to maintain their aid for the full academic year. That being said, and Carla mentioned this as well, if you only evaluate annually, the student is disqualified for financial aid at the point of evaluation, which does not give them adequate warning to get whatever assistance they need with their academic and non-academic related needs.
Yeah, great point, Sarah. And one thing that we want to share with everyone is if your institution, if you know you have staff that are communicating with students about these things, but they may not know everything there is to know about SAP, this is a great, helpful graphic for those folks on your staff, as well as we're going to share a pretty incredible, it's probably the most comprehensive SAP report I've ever seen, as nerdy as that sounds, at the very end of this presentation that you can actually use in your office to help folks better understand what SAP is. And it might be an opportunity of a little bit of a train the trainer to make sure that all of your student success staff are aware of your institution's policy and knows how to connect students to resources and that kind of thing. So our three main buckets that we're going to talk about today and how you can be flexible with your institutional SAP policies and practices and make sure you're communicating with students clearly and effectively and on time is that we think the language of how you communicate in the policy matters, the systems in which you use to communicate with those students and the levers that students have to kind of help themselves on their way, find resources. And then the technology also matters, right? We know that COVID accelerated a lot of remote technologies and communication technologies that maybe institutions weren't ready for. We're going to talk about all three of those things. So Sarah, back to you a little bit, how does SAP affect students, and how then are we going to kind of pivot to how we can anticipate some of those challenges and help students out?
Sure. So as we were digging into the issues around SAP, we started with a literature review, and you've already sort of alluded to this a little bit, Zach, but there is not an abundance of literature on this topic, which was really surprising to us. But one research study that we did find relied on semi-structured interviews with community college students. And they interviewed students who were meeting SAP and those who were not meeting SAP. And what they found was that both of those student groups had the same level of motivation to pursue post-secondary education. So they were both really committed to their programs, really thought that this was something that was going to better their lives. However, the students who were not meeting SAP had significantly more life responsibilities and fewer resources. They were often parents or they were caregivers of relatives. They had issues with transportation. They didn't have access to a variety of basic needs, including housing. And they had less cultural capital. So they didn't have a lot of people in their lives who had navigated higher ed, let alone financial aid and SAP issues. And so they just ended up really kind of at a disadvantage. We also found that they had greater feelings of powerlessness that stemmed from childhood trauma, and that often included having child welfare system involvement, being in a family situation where there was domestic violence, and or frankly, being impoverished. So there were just huge differences in sort of their life experiences and their access to resources to help them navigate higher education.
Absolutely. And then it becomes then so critical about how we can help educate those students really, really early on, right? And know that your academics are tied to your finances. And this might be a little bit of college knowledge that you don't have to kind of help folks on their way. Sarah, talk a little bit more too about, what does the persistence look like of some of these students who fail to make sense?
Yes. So I'm actually really excited to talk about this slide. So after we realized that there wasn't an abundance of research on this topic, we decided to do our own research. And so we partnered with Educational Results Partnership in California, and they manage all of the data on our California community college system. So for those of you who are maybe less familiar with our California community college system, it's actually the largest public post-secondary institution in the country. It includes 116 campuses and it serves 2.1 million students, about 900,000 of which are full-time. And the thing to know before I talk about this data is that despite the SAP standards and the SAP policies being tied to federal financial aid, including the Pell Grant, including federal student loans, and even some work-study programs, we found that our California Cal Grant program, which is about $2 billion in state-funded financial aid, was also linked to these same SAP federal standards and federal policies, despite the fact that they don't have to be. So that's something to think about as you're looking at your state-funded financial aid and how they are potentially being tied to these federal regulations unnecessarily. So what we did with the data analysis is we looked at first-year students who were enrolling and attending a community college in California and were receiving a Pell Grant. So we specifically wanted to look at that lower income student population. And so this data set included about 77,000 students. And what we found is that 1 in 4 did not meet SAP for their first 2 consecutive terms. When we disaggregated that data by race and ethnicity, we found that African American or Black students, as well as Native American or Alaska Native students, did not meet SAP at twice the rate of Asian and white students. When we looked at this for foster youth, we found that nearly 1 in 3 did not meet SAP. And then when we looked at this for foster youth who identified as African American or Black, we found that the rate was 42%. So again, we're seeing really the same sort of persistent inequities that we see in our K through 12 system, sort of just now being pushed into our higher education programs.
Absolutely. And that's why, so critical that I'm so happy that we're talking to this audience today, because y'all are serving these students of color at your institutions, right? Y'all are working for minority serving institutions. And we know that this is a particular kind of issue with those populations and just not having institutional support, right? So Sarah, what about, past the second term, kind of some of the persistence?
Yes.
What do we think there?
Yes, we were really curious to know. So we know now that 1 in 4 students across the board are not meeting SAP, which is an equity issue in and of itself. But we wanted to know sort of what happens next. Are these students continuing to stay enrolled? Are they receiving financial aid? And what we found when we looked at the subsequent term is that 58% of the students who did not meet SAP ended up disenrolling. And that's compared to only 18% of students who disenrolled who were meeting those SAP standards. So again, major impact on enrollment and persistence.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as we talked about earlier, retaining those students in the future, much more important than maybe recruiting the new students. And how about this maintaining financial aid eligibility? I mean, even the gaps widen here, right?
Yes. So among those students who did not meet SAP during their first 2 consecutive terms, but who remained enrolled, only 23% ended up maintaining their financial aid, including their Pell Grant. So this indicates to us that at least 23% were able to file an appeal and have that appeal approved. What the data couldn't tell us was whether or not the students who continued to stay enrolled, the other 77% who stayed enrolled, and did not receive financial aid, if they ever filed an appeal or if that appeal was denied. So we don't have access to that data. That data was not collected, but it does really point back to some of the qualitative work that we've done with financial aid offices and students, where many of them don't know that they have the option to appeal, and or they end up not filing an appeal because they don't have the support to complete the appeal and produce the documentation that's required to verify their special circumstance. So again, this is an area that we're working on in California to make this much more accessible, to make sure that anytime a student is disqualified from receiving financial aid due to SAP, that they're notified that they have the option to appeal, and that the appeal forms are accessible, and that if there's a situation which is very difficult for them to document or can't be reasonably documented, that they have the option to sort of self-attest and turn in a signed affidavit that says, like, here's my special circumstance. So really trying to figure out how to make the appeals much, much more accessible.
Absolutely. Just thinking this graphic, 75%, right, who fail SAP don't maintain their aid into the third term, right? And like I said earlier, maybe a death sentence for students. It's really, really, really tough. And then, Sarah, elaborate on this figure just really briefly. I mean, this is a really important stat here.
Yes. So when we wanted to kind of look at both enrollment and continued receipt of financial aid, we were trying to kind of determine what was the combined impact of not meeting SAP for those first 2 consecutive terms. And what we found was that in total of those students who didn't meet SAP, 87% had either disenrolled or lost their financial aid. So the implications for students are enormous.
Absolutely. And the Pell Grant is supposed to be the mechanism for those low-income students identified on the FAFSA. And those are the folks that are losing their aid. That's a huge, huge equity concern, massive equity concern. So now then, given all these policy considerations and how difficult it is, Anita, let's talk to you a little bit about what you're actually hearing from students who are kind of navigating all these policies. So we knew that during COVID, and a lot of institutions on this call, I know kind of firsthand, you went to pass-fail grading policies, right? What does that do for SAP? Because all of a sudden the GPA threshold more or less kind of goes out the window, right? What does a pass grade mean or a fail grade mean as it means for GPA requirements for SAP? We also know massive influx of HERF funds. We already know through Sarah's work and through something, things that Carla have talked about, that some institutions may not have appeal policies or appeal practices. And if they do, students might not know about them. So Anita, talk to me a little bit about what are students talking with you about specifically. First, let's start with HERF. What are students talking about? What's the confusion behind HERF and how does it relate to satisfactory academic progress?
Right. So, during the pandemic, a lot of schools got access to HERF funds. And so St. Philip's College was one of those as well. And so we started creating different ways that we can help students through COVID, right? And so student success side of the house received some money to spend for advocacy, as well as the enrollment side of the house, not in the aspects to help them become enrolled, but finding a methodology that can help students stay enrolled in school. And a lot of that happened to be that we were paying balances off in some of the tuition. And so over the summer, as our money started to dwindle down, there was an influx of students coming in stating that they needed help with tuition. And then having that collaboration with across the campus and with financial aid, being able to speak to our financial aid office and asking, what's going on with this student? A lot of it comes down to completion rate, or they left college, and they dropped out, and then coming back and not realizing that they were on academic probation or that their completion rate was causing them not to be eligible for financial aid. And then how can I pay for financial aid? Y'all paid for my tuition last semester. Why can't you pay for it this semester? And so that's the hard discussion to have with students in this aspect, because not only now is their budget being affected because now they have to pay for school, because we do have an appeal process. It's up on our website. It talks about we have an uphill process for the fall and one for the spring, and what's needed from the student and meeting with their advisor and things like that. It's just, does the student know about it? Does the student know how to ask questions? Do they understand the language? And in realizing the influx of students that were coming in the summer, that triggered our classroom presentations to start asking, do you know that you can lose your financial aid if you're not in good academic standing? And a lot of students don't know that. And it's not that we as an institution or any institution is not bringing that up, but it's the students are not understanding what that entails. And so now we're starting to educate the students in that aspect in attending classroom presentations. So far right now, our students are still requesting assistance in tuition and having, again, that hard discussion on what's going on and where their money is going and the aspects of where are you with attending school and how are you paying for it, because you still have to show that you're in good faith going to continue school and make good grades. And so I think that's the hardest conversation to have with students, because they feel almost helpless in the aspects of, well, what am I supposed to do? I want to go to school. I want to better myself, but I can't because I don't have the money.
Yeah, really such heartbreaking discussions, obviously, when a student slowly realizes that it may be the end of the road and they didn't know about it. And that was really something that I know that I had talked with, many project success schools about how you are communicating HERF fund and application availability for students. What was not discussed as much was when that money gets phased out, how do you slowly kind of wean students off of relying on those funds? I talk with a lot of schools who had students that had multiple awards across multiple semesters, right? And you tend to start leaning on that money a little bit. That is not tied to satisfactory academic progress. So Anita, have you had some of those discussions with students that just don't know that the money wasn't going to continue?
Yes, and those are other discussions that are having to be had with them because they think that there's just this pool of money that we can just keep grabbing from and then just awarding for tuition. And so in the summer, already realizing that our money was starting to dwindle down, that myself and the advocacy director, Sasha Wilhelm, started having these discussions with the students, like tuition is a foreseen circumstance, like you have to pay for tuition. This is something that is not free or that gets to be covered. This is not an unforeseen circumstance where we have to now pay for it. But what we can do is look at your budget and see where your money is going to see if we can help figure out how to pay for school. Maybe instead of taking 6 credit hours, we're going to just take 3. And in the aspects of you're still continuing your education, it may take you a little bit longer, but until we can get your foundation stronger financially to continue to help you move forward within your educational journey. But yes, it is heartbreaking to hear a lot of the stories, and it's heartbreaking to have them feel like they're being pushed back or it's a setback. But reinforcing them that, hey, you're still continuing your education. You're not dropping out altogether. And this is something that you financially can afford until you're able to show that you can be in good academic standing and bring your GPA up.
Absolutely. And that's the really important intersection that no one talks about is financial wellness. And if you are financially well and a student can understand their resources and how to kind of get themselves back on that horse, once they fall off, hugely important, because it might be a circumstance where they get the rug pulled out from underneath them a little bit, right? A funding source goes away. And all of a sudden they're pivoting and, I have to cover my costs now directly out of pocket until I remedy my status. And if students don't know their financial wellness resources, they don't know how to budget their money and plan for emergencies like that, how important is it to kind of have a college student rainy day fund just to cover that sticky tuition balance that just is restricting them from continuing in their education? So Anita, we're going to come back to you in a little bit because again, the student experience throughout this is incredibly important. We're going to talk more now about what institutions can do directly, right? So these are going to be things that you can do right now to simplify SAP to alleviate a lot of these concerns about the confusion about appeals and standards and how students can reach out for resources. First and foremost, you got to have a dedicated SAP presence on your website. Should that probably be on the financial aid website? Yes, it should not be buried into a PDF in a course catalog or a student handbook that is buried 5, 10, 15 clicks, right? So it's not burying it also in a frequently asked questions list where a student has to click to understand what the question and the answer is. It should have a dedicated presence. We're going to show you a couple examples of that in a second, of maybe not perfect websites, but at least ones that are very, very clear in their scope and what they're communicating. Also, communicating more frequently. If you can facilitate a warning period and some sort of appeals process, please do that and communicate to students very frequently. Using very simple language and sentence structure, right? If you are, curious about your financial aid website and your SAP policy, you will have my contact info at the end of this session. Please send it to me. I would be happy to analyze it for you for free. And I will give you suggestions about how to simplify that stuff, because if students can't read it and understand it, how are they going to follow those guidelines and actually take action, right? Difficult to understand how they can take action if they don't understand the policy in the first place. Using second person pronouns, you should, because at that point, it is on the student to either appeal or remedy their status. Be direct. All the communication research says that second person language is direct, and it really kind of catalyzes action. And then put SAP other places, right? More of a campus community vibe in terms of communicating this thing instead of just relegating it to financial aid. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Here is Arizona State's University's dedicated SAP website. We thought this was a pretty good example because they have a very clear SAP website, and however, it is not perfect, right? So that very first sentence that actually defines what SAP is all one sentence about the 17th grade reading level. That's really confusing. And then the SAP guide leads to a separate website that has to download a PDF that was not mobile friendly, right? You can see like all these problems start kind of compiling themselves. Best practice having a SAP website, absolutely, but would a student actually go through these steps to understand it? Could they understand the language, and would they jump through all the hoops to actually navigate this kind of SAP handbook? I would argue not. There's also an issue with their website in that they talk about financial aid suspension and satisfactory academic progress, and they redefine SAP in a different way than another part of their website defines it. So the definitions aren't consistent. It does not sound like the prior language they used on another web page. So another suggestion for practitioners is you have that definition, make it as simple as possible, and repeat that verbatim everywhere so that when students are seeking out resources, they see a consistent message no matter where they go, right? Those two definitions of SAP are not the same, but it's the same institution on the same website. Doesn't make much sense to me, right? Consistent communication is really, really, really important. We also found that there are many different ways to define SAP, right? SAP is a federal policy, but look at how these are two different schools now that both define SAP in a different way than Arizona State did, right? So we know students transfer, especially those of you at the community college level, you're going to have those transfer students. Are you making sure that SAP definitions are very, very simple? And you can see the one on top, much simpler than Arizona State's, but then the one on the bottom here is a checklist, right? It's a 1, 2, 3. That's a different way to define SAP. Make sure you do that as simple as possible. We also found the University of South Florida had a really, really fantastic SAP video, kind of a tutorial. They took almost everything that Arizona State had in their PDF handbook for SAP, and they put it in a very student-friendly video. This is a student talking to students about SAP, and look at how simple that is. 1, 2, 3. They explain it in very plain language. If you would send a student this video and say, hey, watch these few minutes, or read this 30-page PDF, you know what students are going to choose, right? Easy choice and a really, really good best practices explaining these processes and policies in different multimedia for sure. We also thought that using a checklist format and embedding resources within that text would also be a really great step forward. One criticism that we've had of some SAP websites is that it doesn't lead students to resources. It explains what the policy is, but how can students actually take action? And then does a student need to read the entire SAP policy? Probably not. They need GPA, course completion, and max time frame, understanding those three things. And then if I get in trouble, how do I appeal? Right? Basic stuff like that. They may not need the whole 30-page PDF. So making sure you cut down on some of that language, only show students what they need to know, and then make contact information available everywhere. So if a student gets a third of the way through, they have a question, they have an escape route to connect with you to make sure that you can help them understand some of those policies and practices. We also thought that SAP could be implemented in many other places. So during the pre-college search, when institutions are going out and recruiting students, making sure that you're explaining that higher education is more than academics. It is one of the largest financial decisions a person will make in their lifetime, and that those academics are connected to those finances. And that is something I have heard countless institutions give their pitch to prospective students. Very, very rarely is financial aid talked about in a critical way that connects academics to finances. And that's got to start happening so students know that there are consequences, unfortunately, for bad grades and not making progress. Also, implementing more SAP information during the FAFSA. There are some policy advocates that are kind of pushing for more educational content within that application or follow-up communication that explains more about what a student just did when they completed the FAFSA, making sure that there's a lot more policy articulation there. And then during college tours, I most recently worked at a four-year university as the assistant director of marketing and communications, and I listened to those college tours, and we did not really speak critically about talking about things beyond scholarships. A lot of that is kind of the selling of the institution, saying we have so many scholarships available, but there's also other critical policies that students need to be made aware of that would probably set them better up for success once they get to the school, knowing that their academics are tied to their finances. We also know that there's mandatory entrance and exit counseling. Institutions should also build that possibly into things like NSO, into things like advising. How are students learning to connect their grades to their finances and knowing where their money comes from, if not from a single email from a financial aid office, right? That's probably not enough. It's also probably not enough to ask students to rely on their student portal for every single piece of information, having them be a self-advocate, right? How do you build in more entrance counseling to explain SAP policies in NSO, new student orientation, or in advising regularly? I know that a lot of academic advisors kind of have a rubric or a checklist that they go through when they do semesterly student meetings, or a student's going to change a major. If a student's going to make a major academic program change, that's when SAP needs to be talked about, because that could extend the maximum time frame. That could affect GPA. We know that when students transition from different majors, GPAs tend to dip temporarily while a student becomes acclimated to that new content. That is where those very specific interventions need to come in, where students are aware of the SAP policies because they're going to make a big change in their academic career. We also think that SAP language should be implemented into syllabi. Faculty should take ownership of student success broadly, and academic success leads then to financial success, being eligible for financial aid. Also, understanding how to communicate over email, and understanding that the way you compose an email and how you engage students over email is going to become increasingly difficult because everyone's sending email these days, making it very, very exciting and interesting so students want to actually click on them. Embedding SAP into grade-related emails as soon as midterm grades or final grades are posted, reminding students that they've made satisfactory academic progress or they're maybe on the borderline. And then also, one thing that I was working on briefly at my former institution is a comprehensive parent campaign that helped parents understand what SAP policies were so that they could help their students out as well. Also, a couple of tech approaches. Does your institution have text messaging capability? Do you have an app? Do you create navigational content like University of South Florida did? How else can you sprinkle satisfactory academic progress throughout the student journey? And then kind of going beyond just web-based information and understanding how can you create audio files, audio books. One thing about that Arizona State SAP handbook is that it was only in plain text. There was no accompanying audio file. That handbook was not ADA compliant in my view. So I think it's really important then, how do you create other kinds of educational content that is beyond just a static web page with text, making that content a little bit more engaging for students? So I am going to cover one of our speakers, Alyssa Takatori, who could not be with us. She had a scheduling conflict today, but I know that Georgia State does integrate some sort of SAP communication and awareness during new student orientation. Before that, they have a pre-orientation. It's called Financing Your Education, and they do address SAP there, as well as every single time there is a new student advising appointment and during new student orientation. Because they've learned through their data analytics that if students don't make SAP, students won't continue. And, that's a gap that they've kind of analyzed within their own institutional research. They also facilitate a first-year seminar course. A lot of that, a lot of schools have implemented first-year seminar courses as a high-impact practice, showing that it does help retain students. SAP information and policies are built into the syllabus and into that course as well for all new students. And then for continuing students, there are a couple of email and communication campaigns called Keep SAP Alive. So in Georgia, there's a HOPE scholarship that is a state-level scholarship that students can be eligible for. They have a campaign called Keep Hope Alive. Well, they mirrored that campaign to keep SAP alive. And those are interventions when students are close to the precipice, right? It's getting to those 2.1, 2.2 GPA students saying, hey, you're close. Watch out. Please reach out to us. Please set an appointment. Or if they have eligibility loss, there's that, hey, you can remain eligible or you can regain eligibility. Let's help you apply for a scholarship. Let's help you get back on the horse and get eligible again. So there's all those communication efforts specifically to help students through SAP. Carla, let's go back to you. What does University of Wisconsin do with some of their SAP communication?
Yeah, so a lot of what we've tried to do, kind of even based on what we've talked about and before that, is really work to simplify our communications, make them as easy as possible to understand and for students to navigate our process, but also to put as much compassion into our language and understanding as we can, which has been very important for our team. So for example, it's not even up on this slide per se, but our notification to students when they fail SAP actually really prioritizes the need for the appeal and how easy it is for students to appeal. So our notice actually tells students right off the bat that 99% of our appeals are approved, as an impetus to help students and encourage them to actually go through that process. Because for us, we see it as very important, not just to have them reinstate their financial aid eligibility, but we require our students to not only submit appeal information themselves, but also to meet with their academic advisor and have their academic advisor also submit something on their behalf as well. And that alone has also been part of our process, and improving it is really working to build the relationships with our academic advisors on campus and make sure they really understand what SAP is, the importance of it, and how they can be a student's advocate in helping them regain that financial aid eligibility, and making sure especially that students have the resources they need academically to be successful moving forward. Maybe it's just as simple as they need help finding some tutoring services or study groups, things along those lines. We really look to those academic advisors to help support. You can see the link there for our website and the headings below. Again, looking to that side of compassion, as we're also very specific in that we don't tell students they're failing SAP. Failing sounds harsh and, kind of end of the world. And we just want to make it clear that this is something that they're not meeting, but there is a process that they can go through, and we want them to go through it so that we can reestablish that aid eligibility as soon as possible. So very simple in terms of our heading and directions. Feel free to take a look at our site, take anything you want from it. I love being able to share what we've already created to other schools and saying, hey, don't try to recreate the wheel. If we figured out kind of what works and what's resonating with students, please take from our examples. We've also made a really big point of getting our forms for this process as accessible as possible. So many moons ago when I first started, we actually just had students write us a letter and just very simple context, kind of explain what was happening, but we weren't really getting the information that we were looking for. So we moved to fillable PDF forms that students could download either through the email we sent them or right off our website. But even within the last few years, we're a PeopleSoft school for our student record information. And we've been able to use their what they call GTE forms to create online forms now, both for students and for academic advisors. So it's an even simpler process for students when they fail SAP. They see it, or fail, not meet SAP. They see it right in their what we call their student center as an item that they need to complete. And then those forms are just right there.
Yeah, really, really easy, super easy heading levels, right? Students can very easily be self-sufficient through that website. So lots of areas of improvement. We have actually covered kind of a lot of those, kind of a lot of those major bullet points. And just making sure too that you're not exceeding federal policy. That's another thing that we didn't talk about as much, but even though you must be as strict or stricter, don't be stricter if you don't have to. That's kind of one of the main takeaways here. So Sarah, talk to us then kind of what are those kind of top main priority buckets?
So we did a community of practice with 19 campuses in California. And over the course of the community of practice, these were the three areas that were most commonly identified as the top priority. The first being communication to students. Again, updating and simplifying the language, making sure that it's consistent on the website's forms, and it's just all around more student friendly, making sure that SAP workshops are being offered, again, as early as possible. New student orientation is a great way to do that. And then also making sure that there's early alert activities. We want to make sure that students know that they're on warning status, what that means for them if they don't meet SAP in the next consecutive term. And then along those lines, not waiting for students to reach out and seek help, but really kind of monitoring their performance, working with faculty to see if there's any sort of early warning signs or indicators that student is struggling, and then reaching out to provide that intrusive coaching. And then last, but certainly not least, updating the appeals policies and processes. Like we've talked about already, this is an area where campuses have an enormous amount of flexibility to make the appeals process as easy as possible and to include a lot of special circumstances that we know our students are experiencing.
Absolutely.
I will say too, go ahead.
Oh, no.
Just on those lines.
Sarah,
yeah.
I was going to say it's kind of an extension of institutions can kind of actually, what institutions can actually do. I mean, talk a little bit about the tool you created and how schools can actually use it to go back and see what they're actually doing.
Yes. So we have an institutional audit tool that campuses can use to compare their current SAP and appeals policies and processes with the federal minimum regulations. So it will help you kind of determine if there's areas where you're really not leveraging your flexibilities, or if you're imposing sort of additional barriers or stricter requirements beyond what's required. So you can scan that QR code to participate. The great news is that if you scan that QR code and you complete the audit tool, I will give you free technical assistance. So complete that tool. And I'd be happy to work with you on looking at your SAP policies and appeals policies.
Absolutely. Lots of free resources today, right? So speaking of free resources, we're just about wrapping up, but we're going to go, get a little bit more feedback. We have a couple more questions to answer. I know we're already at time as well, but this webinar is being recorded. If you have to hop off, no hard feelings, absolutely. But you're going to get a recording of this and you get the slide deck. So we're going to make sure to do this due diligence and make sure to finish up our content. This is a fantastic report. Many, many pages about what you just learned about. And it does kind of, in some ways, audit one of the largest student populations, one of the most diverse student populations in the country. It's a fantastic resource. There's nothing else out there like it. And oh, by the way, it's also free. And if you want to reach out to Sarah about it, she was kind of in charge of the thing. So you're kind of going to speak to someone who did it and can kind of walk the walk and talk the talk in some ways. There are all of our contact information. And I know that there are a couple of questions that we're going to address. And I actually wanted to ask Anita and Carla about this because y'all are the kind of the boots on the ground folks actually doing this. We had a couple of questions. One was, what specific ways do institutions communicate with students to ensure that they're aware that they're in SAP? I mean, are those emails? Are they phone calls? Or what does your school do to do that awareness? And then how do you help students understand actually how to appeal? So, Carla, I'll ask you first, what specific ways do you communicate with students about SAP specifically?
Yeah, so I'll say right up front, I know we could be doing a lot better, especially on the early side of the communications and letting students know even before they start school what SAP is and the implications of it. Kind of like we talked about, we battle for time with prospective and incoming students with all of the other things getting them ready for college. So we tend to actually focus mostly on our high need financial aid recipients. So those that are in our financial aid programs. For example, one of them, we actually do an in-person orientation when they start on campus, and SAP is something that's highlighted as part of that orientation. But that's only a small proportion of all of our financial aid recipients that get that kind of one-on-one. Otherwise, our primary form, besides our website and then again communicating through campus and having those relationships, is primarily email. So when we do run SAP at the end of the academic year, students are sent an email letting them know what happened, what the process is to move forward, and how to reach out for us for help. We also then, because that can sometimes unfortunately impact our students for summer and how quickly they get their summer financial aid when we are, checking SAP at the end of the spring semester. So they get subsequent contacts, both email and sometimes phone calls, to try to get them to respond more quickly to go through that appeal process. And thankfully, our appeal process is so simple that we don't actually get too many questions about how to complete it, because it really is just fill out this form, answer these questions, go meet with go meet with your academic advisor or an academic advisor. It doesn't have to be their assigned one, just someone that can speak to their progress, and have that advisor sit down with them and then fill out that form as well. But we just try to make it clear kind of across the board how available our team is for anything, whether it's to help through the SAP process or anything else related to financial aid.
Yep. So kind of it takes all types, right? So attacking that issue from multiple angles, right? Communicating with students in lots of different methods and modes, right? Anita, I was going to ask back to you, when you're helping students understand and have an understanding of their own financial wellness, have you helped students through the appeal process? Do they know about it? I mean, what are some of your experiences with getting students back to eligibility if they need to be?
So I just met with a student yesterday who had walked over from the Welcome Center, who had already met with someone in the Welcome Center who gave them, she met with financial aid. She met with our circling desk to schedule an appointment with her certified advisor. And so financial aid actually hands out, like a piece of paper, giving them step-by-step on what they need to do. And she just wanted to make sure, is this right? So we walked back over there together and just taking the time. But we do, I do know that financial aid does it once a year, and usually at the end of May, just to see where students are after grades have posted. We don't do an early warning from what I understand. And so they automatically go into, having to go through an appeal process. So students are aware. They do get an email from financial aid letting them know that they have been put on academic suspension and that they had to complete an appeal and then to meet with their advisor. They go in and talk with financial aid. I've had students reach out to me, Miss, what does this mean? And I'm like, well, that means that your GPA dropped below 2.0. And that means that your financial aid is now you're not going to get financial aid and have to pay out of pocket or appeal. So that's the gist that I know as far as how the process goes at SPC, and as far as students coming in and letting me know this is my concern, and it's always reverting back to let's walk down to the Welcome Center together and learn together.
Yep, exactly. And that's a huge kind of element of all this, is that we're talking about student grades and student finances, which are very personal, and they're not the most comfortable topics. So another piece of this is there someone on your student success team that students are familiar and comfortable with, like Anita? So when they get information from another part of campus and maybe they don't trust it, maybe they don't understand it, they want someone else to confirm what they think they know, reaching out to one of those student success folks like Anita to say, does this make sense to you? What am I supposed to be doing? Maybe the student does know, but they need someone at the institution that they trust to walk them through that process, which that is another one of the kind of hidden hurdles of this, is once a student may be deemed ineligible for aid, they may not see the school as a support system anymore. So they might be trying to collect outside resources, not knowing that the school can still help them get connected to people and resources that can help them persist, right? So that it's very stigmatizing, not feeling like you made satisfactory academic progress and feeling like you don't belong to the school anymore. And people, like Anita and Carla, who connect with students on a daily basis and are emailing and are connecting with them, it's incredibly important for students to establish some sort of sense of belonging. So, schools and students can stay connected no matter what the student's eligibility status is. So we are just about wrapped up. There was a question in the Q&A. Yes, I know Teresa will make sure to send out all the information, right? So there's going to be a recording. I see that this has been recorded the entire time. We're also going to be sending your slide deck, a bunch of links to resources, and you have all of our contact info. If you want to reach out to one of us and have a chat and talk about this and talk about what your school can do, we'd love to hear from you, right? Sarah has done an incredible amount of research in California. Hey, project success states, Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia. Let's get on that horse, right? Let's talk about SAP. Let's try to, develop some sort of community of practice and get some advocacy going in other places other than California. Sarah has started the work. Let's continue it other places. So with that, on behalf of Anita and Sarah and Carla, and then Alyssa in absentee, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. If you have any questions, please reach out, but have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday. And we'll see you next time in about a month. We're going to be talking about evaluating student success programs. So I will be back with you. I see a couple of familiar names. It will not be the last time. I will see y'all in about a month. So take care. Have a great Wednesday. Thanks, everybody.